All right. Good morning, everybody. For those of you who are joining us in time zones where it's still morning, and good afternoon for those of you joining us where it is now the afternoon. My name is Scheyd. I'm an associate professor of psychology here at Nova Southeastern University, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I'm going to be talking about the art and science of brains and behavior. So mainly what I'm going to be doing is sort of jumping around among different topics that we cover in the field of psychology, different topics that have been studied in scientific psychology, and showing, on the one hand, how those topics have been presented in popular media, movies and TV shows particularly, and then discussing some of the research to sort of compare and contrast with how these things are depicted by Hollywood versus what we learned in the laboratory, basically. So without further ado, let me just sort of jump into the first topic here and want to talk about memory. There are plenty of great examples of movies depicting issues with memory, people, or in some cases fish, experiencing problems related to amnesia. And so I just wanted to kind of introduce and give an overview of what we cover in psychology when we teach about memory. And talk about some of the major categories in memory, because it turns out not all memories work in the same way, not all memories are encoded in the same way, using the same neural pathways and so forth. So we make these distinctions conceptually of different types of memory. So semantic memory is just sort of like factual information. So if you remember Paris is the capital of France, that's where the Eiffel Tower is located, so forth. Those are semantic memories. We contrast those with episodic memories. So if you remember first date that you went on with somebody, or remember learning how to ride a bike, remember your first day of school, any particular event that you can sort of like recall and replay from your own like autobiographical memory, that's what we mean by episodic memory. So those episodes from the past. And then there's procedural memory. That's different because in this case, it's not the factual information that you're remembering, but the technique for doing something. So if you've learned how to roller skate, let's say, or learned how to ride a bike, right? The memory of learning those things would be an episodic memory, but the ability to do them draws upon your procedural memory. Your muscle memory is sometimes referred to as basically procedural memory. And so in cases where people are experiencing amnesia, where they've had some sort of brain damage, or there's a tumor or a lesion, they've had brain surgery, potentially could have caused it. That can lead to amnesia in some cases that dramatically impacts one or two of these, but leaves the other more or less intact. And so I want to show you first of all some sort of like silly depictions, but widespread ones that we've seen over the years in sitcoms and cartoons and so forth. And this is a depiction of what's called retrograde amnesia. So what happens, typically the trope goes, character gets bonked on the head by something, rock, a coconut, whatever it might be, and they regain consciousness, but they can't remember who they are, they can't recognize their friends and family members and so forth. And so then you have this nice, 22-minute sitcom episode of a main character who's sort of a fish out of water. And at some point, generally towards the end of the episode, they get bonked on the head again, and that just sort of like resets them and brings their memories back. So, how accurate is this? This is wildly inaccurate, basically. It's not inaccurate to say that a concussion can cause some memory loss. But to say that the solution for that is to produce the same type of concussion, the same area with the same force, and that toggles it back to now they have their memory back, that doesn't work at all. If somebody gets hit and it causes brain damage, and you hit them again, that's just going to cause more brain damage. So it doesn't actually work that way. But there are, as I say, there are cases of legitimate amnesia, and in the case of a typical concussion, there's some sort of like transient amnesia. People struggle for a little while, but after a few days, typically have recovered, except in cases of like the most severe traumatic brain injuries. So I'm going to show a clip now from The Bourne Identity. So just to set it up, this is a character who does have retrograde amnesia. He suffered some trauma prior to the start of the first movie and can't remember his identity, doesn't know where he came from, doesn't really remember anything from his past. And he's just sort of like struggling to find his way in the world when this happened. So I'm gonna jump over to share another screen here so you can see the video.
Mal schauen. Hey, können Sie die Schilder nicht lesen? So, aufstehen. Los, auf jetzt. Der Park ist geschlossen. Sie können hier nicht schlafen. Alright. Zeigen Sie mir Ihren Ausweis. No, I don't. Ihre Papiere. I don't have any papers. I lost meine Papiere. Ich habe sie verloren. Genug. Stehen Sie jetzt auf. Ich muss schlafen. Los, hoch. Hey, aufstehen. Hoch.
What you see there is a character who has lost his semantic memories, lost his episodic memories, particularly, but he has retained procedural memories. And typically, when you do have severe cases of retrograde amnesia, it's not so clear cut where there's like definite loss of the semantic or episodic memories, but full retention of the procedural memories. But that is what they're showing in the movie. So it's a good illustration for pointing out just the distinctions among these different types of memory. So that's an example of retrograde amnesia, which is what I've been talking about up to this point. Person has some sort of brain injury, causes a loss of things that they used to know. This is in contrast to what's called anterograde amnesia. In the case of anterograde amnesia, sort of like the amnesia, instead of going back in time, is going forward in time from the point at which they had the injury, the lesion, the tumor, the surgery, whatever. They still remember things prior to the onset of that, but now they can't form new long-term memories after that. And this is what's depicted in movies such as 50 First Dates and the one that I have image from down here, which is Memento. So show a scene from that as well right now.
Speaker around. Let's see.
Did you sleep okay?
Yeah. You?
Shit. I gotta be someplace.
Useful. You never write a phone on running here?
I should be able to talk to my friend today about the license plate.
Yeah, the license plate.
John G's license plate. You have it tattooed on your thigh.
Natalie. She has also lost someone. She will help you out of pity.
If it's registered in the state, it should only take a couple seconds to pull up his license and registration. I'll call you as soon as I talk to him.
Do you think we could just arrange a meeting now? I'm not too good on the phone. You know, it's great that you... Well, that you're helping me like this.
I'm helping you because you helped me. The next time you see me, will you remember me?
Okay, so I'm being depicted here, as you may have picked up from the clip, as the character is experiencing anterograde amnesia. He can't remember who this woman is because he met her after the point at which he developed the case of anterograde amnesia. So he would still remember people he knew from his childhood. He would still remember facts from up until the point where the anterograde amnesia began. But any new person he meets after that is going to be a stranger as soon as they leave the room, and about 30 seconds have elapsed because he doesn't have new long-term memories, including for people that he meets after this. So there are a couple of major case studies in psychology that are depictions of, or that are real life cases of people with anterograde amnesia. So when I was still in college, the first one was just presented as the case of HM. He was still basically anonymous at that point when he was still alive. It was after he passed away, we learned what his actual identity was, but there had been, like many clinicians, neurologists, and experimental psychologists that had studied him over the years due to his pretty much complete case of anterograde amnesia. So what happened was, when he was a younger man, about 20 years old, he had epilepsy. It was becoming more and more severe, and they were concerned that the seizures were so severe that eventually they would kill him. And so in order to alleviate that, they performed pretty dramatic brain surgery. They removed the hippocampus and surrounding areas in the temporal lobe. So the hippocampus is responsible for the encoding of long-term memories. So it's not like where the memories are stored per se, but it's the structure that allows you to store long-term memory in the first place. And so once they removed that, while the surgery was successful in the sense that it prevented him from having these life-threatening seizures, it left him unable to learn anything basically after this point. But as in the case that we looked at from the born identity, he was able to still acquire new procedural memories. So he could meet a doctor every day for an entire year, and each time it would be like he was meeting a stranger because he wouldn't remember that. But if they had him learn a particular procedure, have him learn how to juggle or something, they could ask him, "Have you ever juggled before?" He would say, "No, I've seen it on TV, whatever. I've seen people perform before. I've never tried it myself." And they would say, "Okay, why don't you give it a shot?" And so he would, throw the balls in the air. They would just bounce all over the place. He didn't know what he was doing. They would say, "Why don't you practice for a little while?" And so he, practice juggling for 15 or 20 minutes and, get a tiny bit better at it, and just have him come in and do that day after day. And you would think this sort of thing might get boring, being studied and having to go to clinics and having to go in the labs and be observed day after day. But for him, it was a new experience because of the anterograde amnesia. So he was able to develop the skill. He would, get better at juggling, and they could ask him again, after a couple of weeks of this, "Have you ever juggled before?" And he would say, "No, I've never done it before myself. I'm familiar with it." And I'd say, "Here, we have some balls here. Why don't you practice?" And so he'd pick them up, and he had gotten better at it. And he was just amazed, thinking that he was a complete natural at these various tasks that they had him perform, until he became very skilled at them, but would have no memory, no episodic memory of having trained on them before. So that's the case of HM. There's sort of an even more extreme case than his, though, and that's Clive Waring, who's a music professor and a musician. And I'm going to show you a little clip of him as well, because he has not only pretty much complete anterograde amnesia, but also pretty severe retrograde amnesia as well. So he's sort of the most complete case of amnesia documented.
Is consigned to live entirely within the present, with terrible consequences. Clive Waring has the worst case of amnesia ever known. 20 years ago, he lost his memory. And now his wife, Deborah, is the only person he recognizes.
Really only has less than 30 seconds memory. And sometimes it's as little as perhaps 7 seconds. It's as little as a sentence. I'm going to see your sister, Adele. Her daughter's got married recently in New Zealand. And so they're having a party.
It's funny how the ladies acquire different titles when they get married.
Do you know who I'm going to see tomorrow?
Buckingham Palace.
No, really guess.
I don't know.
You don't know?
Mm.
Adele.
Oh, I see.
Do you know why I'm going?
No.
She's having a party at her house tomorrow.
It's her birthday, isn't it?
No.
No.
Do you know why?
No.
It's to do with her daughter.
I see.
Do you know why her daughter's having a party?
No.
Guess.
No, I don't.
She's just got married.
Oh, I see.
She just got married, and do you know what country she just got married in?
No, I don't.
In New Zealand.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. The sentence he is in, he will probably have forgotten the sentence before. You ask him a question, and he'll give you an answer. But while he's giving you the answer, he's already forgotten the question. That's how short it is. I'm going to see your kids tomorrow.
You want to see my kids?
Yeah, your children.
What are they up to now?
Do you know what they're up to
No,
now?
no.
Guess what you think they're up to.
No idea. I couldn't guess. I don't know what their O-levels were. They hadn't got an O-level last time I was conscious. So I don't know what possible thing they could do, do they? And I couldn't possibly guess.
Where do you think they are?
No idea. Don't know where I am.
All he has is void behind him.
It's been like death. I've never seen a human being before. Never had a dream or a thought. The brain has been totally inactive. Day and night the same. No thoughts at all. As far as I'm concerned, the doctors have been totally incompetent. I've never seen a doctor the whole time.
Kiss. I'm busy. I don't know which part of the room I'm standing in.
How many dogs?
So, as you can see, it's a dramatically different life if you don't have memory or essentially have no memory at all. If they're episodic or semantic or procedural memories, of course, will be completely different. He has loss of most of his episodic memories, and he also experiences both anterograde and retrograde amnesia at the same time, but still has a connection to his wife. It's just for whatever reason she's the only person that he has that connection with, that somehow was retained. What happened in his case that caused the onset of amnesia in the first case was he had a viral infection developed into encephalitis, and so the brain injury that developed as a result of that led to his both retrograde and anterograde amnesia. Okay, so moving on to a different topic now, away from memory and amnesia, into dissociative states, sort of conceptually related in some sense. When we get to this one, it's called psychogenic fugue. But first, I want to talk about dissociative identity disorder. And this is what was formerly referred to as multiple personality disorder, and just branded with the more recent name dissociative identity disorder, indicating that there is a dissociative state and the person is essentially like not aware that they have switched to sort of different, well, what would be called personality under personality or multiple personality disorder. So the Fight Club is a depiction of that, but bearing in mind the first rule of Fight Club, I will not discuss that further. I do, however, want to talk about the case of Kenneth Bianchi. He was a serial killer known as the Hillside Strangler. And his is an interesting case for a couple of reasons. First, in that, most true crime cases tend to be interesting if you're talking about serial killers. But in his particular case, there was evidence of what at the time was still called multiple personality disorder. And this is, after he'd been apprehended, he was in jail. And he met with his attorneys, he'd been interrogated by the police, all this was going on. And it seemed apparent to them that he had really very distinct personalities, where most of the time he was just this sort of like kind, shy, retiring, friendly sort of person, gentle even. And then occasionally he would just kind of snap and then switch into this like an enraged figure. And so they were speculating maybe like, oh, this is what's going on. Like most of the time he's perfectly nice, perfectly harmless, but he has this other side of himself that sometimes gets flipped on for whatever reason. And that's the side of himself that's going out and committing the murders. And there was a psychologist for the prosecution that came in to meet with him and had like a different hypothesis for what was going on, which is thinking like, basically he's just faking it. He's thinking like he's going to get a lesser sentence or he's going to be acquitted or something. If he can convince the court, convince the jury that, oh, it wasn't me who did it, it was his other personality. We just have to, you know, get rid of that. But I'm not really guilty myself. So the psychologist who met with him on behalf of the prosecution had the idea of just sort of like planting some false information there and sort of like setting a trap for him. And so what he did was just over the course of meeting with him for about an hour, he just kind of like slipped into the conversation. And an interesting thing that we've learned in the field of psychology is that when somebody does have multiple personalities, it's never just two personalities. There's always at least a third, maybe a fourth in all the cases that have been documented so far. And then just, you know, went back to conversing about whatever else they'd been discussing there. And then told everybody else, like, basically, if I'm correct about this, then watch out because, you know, tomorrow he's going to show up. He's going to have a third personality that shows up. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. This like little child that was this third personality that he had invented right on cue, trying to like, you know, again, mask the fact that no, he was really this serial killer and he was just putting on a charade to try to convince people that he wasn't really guilty in the same sense that it would be if he only just had the one personality that was himself. And a further investigation of his house revealed that he had actually a stack of like psychology textbooks in his house where he had like marked certain pages and was highlighting certain areas where he was like trying to study different disorders and take notes on like how should I present myself in order to make a convincing case that this is really what's going on. So he didn't quite get away with it, but seems like maybe he almost did. So that's a case of dissociative identity disorder pretended. And I think that's actually a helpful illustration because it is more common for people to sort of act out having multiple personalities probably than it is for people to actually have clear, you know, dissociation and switch from one personality to another, not have control over it, not know what the other personality is doing. There are some cases for people who have undergone just the most severe forms of trauma imaginable, where they really do dissociate and they're like blocked out memories and they can like adopt a different personality as sort of a coping strategy and so forth. So this does happen from time to time, but if you're just weighing like how frequent is that, legitimate cases of that happening compared to how frequent is somebody, you know, pretending for their own benefit to be suffering from this condition, probably more cases of the latter than of the former. The same is true for psychogenic fugue state, and probably the best known depiction of this in movies or TV shows comes from Walter White in Breaking Bad. And here what you see is screenshot from when he walks into a store just completely naked and he shows up and like claims like he doesn't remember where he's been, he doesn't know what happened. And he is in fact just, again, even within the show, he's acting out that he's undergone this state of what's called psychogenic fugue, which is you basically you lose your identity, you can't remember your past life, you end up in a different town, you start a new life, you get a new job, you start a new family, having no memory of the one in the past. And there are cases where it appears that this has happened at least a handful of times for people who have undergone, you know, trauma and warfare and other, again, very extreme cases of trauma. But those are outweighed by the number of people who would just sort of like pretend to be undergoing this sort of thing, and they're really just kind of like acting out a part. You can imagine there would be plenty of circumstances where a person would be like, oh, boy, I've really screwed up my life here. How can I get out of this? And resort to something as drastic as, what if I just pretend I can't remember anything about, what bills I owe and what people I have offended and betrayed in the past, and I move to a new town and start a new life. So, they have every reason to try to make a convincing case of it. But in fact, yeah, the legitimate cases of this are exceedingly rare, and I think some clinical psychologists would say they're almost non-existent. So that's psychogenic fugue, another dissociative state. From that, I moved to something that's much more common, which is clinical depression. This is what's sometimes referred to as the common cold of psychological disorders. It's widespread to the extent that, like, basically everyone is familiar with it, even if they haven't personally experienced it. They have a friend who has, or they have a family member who has. The rates of depression are about 7 or 8%, and that's per year. So 7 to 8% of people worldwide will experience clinical depression this year. 7 or 8% of people experienced it last year. Sometimes it's the same people, struggling with it year in and year out. Other people may experience it once or twice in their lifetime. But on average, since it's 7 to 8% per year, most people do experience a bout of clinical depression more than once in their life. I don't know why it's often the case that these equine characters are the ones depicted as having depression, or to put it another way, I guess, why the long face. But people are, I think, generally familiar with the nature of depression, and putting it into a comedy show can sort of work, I guess, for the comedy. But of course, for the person who's actually experiencing depression, it's not an enjoyable experience at all. There's just a lack of motivation. There's severe interference with normal sleep-wake cycles and with diet, and just a loss of interest in, even the things that they most enjoyed before, hanging out with their friends and their hobbies and so forth. And in severe cases, that people, don't have sufficient motivation to get out of bed and just engage in like basic hygiene practices, let alone carry on with their life just fine. Related to that, though, I would say, like, about the character Eeyore, although he's sort of like presented as an archetypal example of characters experiencing depression, he's might be more likely to actually get a diagnosis of what's called dysthymia, which is depression if you just sort of like stretch it out over a much longer period of time, but it's not quite as severe at any particular point in time. So whereas a bout of major depressive disorder might last for a month or two, for the person who's like completely debilitated by it, somebody with dysthymia may just be in sort of, this severely blue mood like Eeyore for a period of years, where it's never quite so severe that it prevents them from like being able to carry out basic daily functions, but it's just essentially it's a part of their personality that they have a depressive air about them. So that's Eeyore. Just a couple of, I think, good depictions of depression in movies. Philip Seymour Hoffman in The Savages, Bill Murray as Steve Zissou in The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou. And I think these are about as realistic as you can get. I mean, if you have a movie that is just a straightforward depiction of depression, if anybody's ever seen the documentary From, about the cartoonist Art From and his brothers, it just seems like everybody in the family is depressed. It's just, it's a downer of a movie for obvious reasons. And so I think what Hollywood tends to do with depression, as with most other things, is just like find ways to make it like not quite as depressing an experience, even if depression is the thing that you're viewing. But you do basically see in Philip Seymour Hoffman's portrayal, as well as in Bill Murray's portrayal, what a person would be behaving like while experiencing depression. I'm going to switch now from depression to obsessive compulsive disorder, and among sort of the most popular recent depiction of that in television. And so you have what it gets its name from, the obsessions and the compulsions. So the obsessions refer to these like persistent thoughts. A person with OCD may be concerned, for instance, that driving home from the grocery store, they hit somebody with their car, although that in fact didn't happen at all. They just have this thought in the back of their head, like, wait a second, what if I did? And they have to go out and check and make sure, is there somebody lying there bleeding in the street? And, you know, a part of them is like well aware, like, no, this really didn't happen. And then another part of them is like, yeah, maybe it did. You can't be sure, you better go check it out. And then the compulsions, which are these sort of like ritualized behaviors that the person will perform that serve to sort of like reduce anxiety, and they also reduce the stress that they're experiencing from the obsessions. And so these are often like cleaning. Person may, you know, wash their hands, not, you know, 7 or 8 times a day, but like 100 times a day, to the point that it's damaging the skin and, you know, maybe even causing bleeding because they've worn away so much of the skin. Also, checking. So person feels like, I'm not sure if I locked the door. By the time they get to the driveway and they're sitting down in their car, so they walk back up to the front door of the house and the door of their apartment and check again, make sure, okay, it's locked, and then they walk back to the car. By the time they get back to the car, they think, wait a second, did I really lock it? Let me double check. So that sort of checking behavior is also seen frequently, and also counting. So counting steps as they're walking down the street or as they're walking down a flight of stairs. And Howard Hughes is sort of the famous example of a celebrity who experienced OCD towards the end of his life, depicted in the movie The Aviator. And like, as I'm describing these things, you may be thinking, oh, wait a second, I might have a little bit of that myself. I think I do some of this counting, I do some of this checking. But the thing to understand about obsessive compulsive disorder is there's not really a sort of a discrete difference between the people who have it and the people who don't. There's a normal distribution of these OCD tendencies, where it's rare to find somebody who doesn't do it at all. So that would be like on one long tail of the distribution, way out, you know, to the left end, let's say. And the people who are severely debilitated by it are the people who are doing it to such an extreme degree that it really is interfering with daily functions. They can't get to work on time, get to school on time, they can't keep a date, and so forth, because they're having to go back and check, not once or twice, but, you know, did I lock the door? And it's now like the 30th time they've checked in the past, you know, 10 minutes. So they're not going to be able to get anywhere on time. Related to that also, you know, if you set an alarm for yourself, you want to make sure you wake up at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. So you set the alarm, your head hits the pillow, and then you think, wait a second, let me make sure I set it correctly. Let me make sure I didn't turn the sound off. Let me make sure, and a couple of things to check. And you lie down again. If you're checking it once or twice, just to make sure, that's like basically an adaptive thing to do. You're going to be better off in the long run if you're careful and checking things a couple of times. But in the case that would be diagnosed as somebody actually having OCD, they're not going to be checking it once or twice. They're going to be checking it 25, 30 times. And, you know, just as they start to drift off, the thought pops back in their head again, you better check. And so causing, not just making them late for things, but, you know, cutting into their sleep. And then that itself has all kinds of negative consequences for psychology, including increasing risk of depression. So basically, what happens in, you know, trying to apply a DSM diagnosis to decide does somebody have OCD or not, it's not like, do you ever do this stuff, but like determining how far up they are in the tail of the curve, and just we sort of arbitrarily draw a line around the point where, okay, this is the point where it seems like it's really severely impairing everyday functioning for the person, as opposed to just like, here's a thing that they do that maybe they find mildly annoying, but they can't seem to stop doing it anyway. Okay, so paranoid schizophrenia, I wanted to mention and contrast it with depression, because while depression is, as I said, is referred to sometimes as the common cold of mental disorders, paranoid schizophrenia would be, under that same analogy, would be basically like the cancer of psychological disorders, where the person has this separation between the way that everybody else perceives the world to be and what they're perceiving at the same time. So that's particularly characterized by having florid hallucinations. Most commonly, those are auditory hallucinations, but you see visual hallucinations as well. The auditory hallucinations, that's, somebody hearing voices in their head, and depending on what culture you're in and depending on how you're using the language, hearing a voice in your head might be something completely innocuous. It might just be your way of describing, like, having a thought, or thinking that I don't know, you're developing a plan, or you're praying, or whatever it might be described in certain cultures as voices in their head. But for somebody who actually does have schizophrenia, it's a voice that's basically as vivid as hearing an actual voice, a person standing right in front of you and speaking, and that you would like confuse for, like, where's that sound coming from, before or unless you've been experiencing it for a while and you understand, okay, I do have schizophrenia and I am experiencing these hallucinations, they're not real. So there are cases where the person has, it's a severe enough case that they genuinely are experiencing those hallucinations, but not so severe that it's gotten to the point where they don't recognize that they are hallucinations. The typical onset of schizophrenia is during the period that we refer to as emerging adulthood. So this is basically in early adulthood, like 18 to 25, is when those cases of schizophrenia first develop. So the onset would be at some point during those years. And you get similar conditions can be triggered by like abuse of amphetamines and so forth. But basically, if it's it's causing this separation between reality and what the person suffering the condition is experiencing, then that's what basically qualifies it as a clinical case of schizophrenia. Paranoid schizophrenia specifically, you also have these delusions of persecutions depicted in A Beautiful Mind, the true story of John Nash, and also depicted in Black Swan, Natalie Portman. And I think what Hollywood gets wrong in these cases is just sort of like exaggerating quite how vivid the imagery is in the cases of the visual hallucinations. But the auditory hallucinations absolutely can be, every bit as vivid or seem every bit as real as just hearing a person's voice. The other thing to note about them is that it's never the voice that you want to have in your head. It's not, you wake up and you're experiencing auditory hallucinations and it's some inspiring voice telling you that you're going to have a fantastic day and you're going to go out there and accomplish all of your goals. It's just, insulting you and degrading you, and you can't get the voice to go away. You might try covering your ears, but it's coming from inside your head, not from outside your ears, so that doesn't help. And so it's, the person really does suffer greatly from paranoid schizophrenia. This ends up impacting about 1% of people, so it's not quite as rare as you might think, but certainly it's more rare than something like major depressive disorder or a bout of major depression would be. It's associated with swollen ventricles in the brain. There's heightened amount of dopamine activity in the brain. And so a lot of the like anti-schizophrenic or antipsychotic medications that have been developed work on the dopamine system to try to block the effects of the dopamine. And those are somewhat effective. It's sort of like damping down the intensity of the symptoms that the person is experiencing. So it does seem to be that there's a causal link between the amount of dopamine and how intense the hallucinations and delusions are. That's as a side effect of that medication, though, you have sometimes the person will develop like muscle tics and twitches and so forth. And so if you've ever seen either depicted on a TV show or like in real life, a person who has schizophrenia and has the muscle tics, it's not caused by the schizophrenia itself. It's a side effect of the medication. So it means they are taking the medications, what's called tardive dyskinesia. It's possible for other things to be causing muscle tics, but that is sort of the most likely explanation in that case, because it is a side effect of a lot of the antipsychotic medications. Okay, so that brings us to psychopathy. And the way that psychopaths tend to be depicted in movies is, as you see on this slide here, in case like Cape Fear and Silence of the Lambs and so forth, where it's just a ruthless, cold-blooded murderer, basically, trying to wreak havoc and go around moving at a trail of dead bodies in their wake, and not having any concern about it, because that's how psychopaths are, at least in the model that is put forward in a lot of these popular movies from Hollywood. But if you contrast that with what Robert Hare has discovered in his clinical research on psychopaths, he's developed psychopathy questionnaire. He's studied psychopaths in prison for many years, and is considered sort of the country's foremost expert on psychopaths. The traits that you see, so glib, superficial charm. So the person comes across and they have like this sort of like penetrating stare and a like beautiful smile, and they have like the perfect pickup line and so forth, and they don't seem to be at all nervous about anything. They don't seem to be all embarrassed. They're just like very cool, very confident, and charming, right? So I mean, there's a tendency for people to think like if somebody is like really awkward, like that's a creepy person, you got to watch out for them. But I would say you have to watch out more for the people who are a little bit too charming than for the people who just like don't seem to have any of that charm, or I guess what the kids call riz at all. The awkward person just is an awkward person and generally harmless. The charming person is potentially dangerous, and they will use that charm to great effect for their own benefit and at others' expense. So grandiose sense of self as well. They think they're fantastic. They're aware that other people would see some of the things that they're doing as immoral, or in some cases as criminal acts. But they don't see it that way. They just see it as like if somebody is stupid enough to like fall for my line here, then they deserve to be taken advantage of. So pathological lying. What prevents a lot of people from lying in most circumstances is just they're worried about like, what if I get caught? That would be so humiliating. Not that they refuse to lie under any circumstances, but it just like seems like it wouldn't even be in their own self-interest. Psychopaths don't seem to be bothered by that risk at all. They just go ahead and tell lie after lie. You catch them in a lie, and then they'll say, no, that's not what I said, or what I meant was, and while you're misinterpreting it, and to just like very smoothly talk their way out of pretty much anything that another person would be, too embarrassed to show their face again if they caught in the same situation. So highly manipulative, and probably the most important feature distinguishing psychopaths from the rest of us is just a lack of remorse and empathy. So it's not just that they do mean things to other people. Like most people from time to time do something that's kind of unkind to another human being, but when they do, they generally feel kind of bad about it, and they're like, yeah, they shouldn't have done that, and still have a sense of remorse that like keeps them on track, so they're not just doing that all the time. And there is just an utter lack of that in psychopaths. They're not bothered by having abused somebody else or taken advantage of somebody else in a way that serves their own interest. Again, they just see it as like if a person like fell for my lies, then they deserve to be taken advantage of. I'm just better at understanding how to navigate the social world than these other people are. So too bad for them. And it's not that they don't understand what empathy is, or that they don't understand what remorse is. They understand it. And the analogy that I read one time, and this was from like a psychopath in prison who's being interviewed about it and asked to describe it. He says, well, I can understand empathy in the same way that somebody who's like totally colorblind can learn how to like read a traffic light. You just know, okay, this one's red, this one's yellow, this one's green. Then you just memorize, okay, what does it look like when a person is experiencing sadness, or when a person is experiencing guilt, and they're not experiencing feelings of remorse and empathy themselves, but they can recognize it in other people. They can see like when they're eliciting it, they've told somebody a lie, some sob story, and now the person like really does seem upset by it and want to help, and like, great, that's what they're looking for. Now they've hooked the person, and they can get them to give them $10 or whatever it is that they're looking to get from them. In a lot of cases, it's much more severe than that. So antisocial behavior, they tend to have impulsivity, poor behavioral controls, lead a parasitic lifestyle. So they may shack up with somebody for a while, and then get access to their bank account, take all of their money, and then skip town and do the same thing with another victim a week later, and just sort of like go about repeating this behavior over and over again. They are the tendency to develop into a psychopath is foreshadowed by behavioral problems earlier in life, not just sort of like being disruptive in class, but sort of a classic example of children who like to torture animals and things like that. That is, in fact, associated with tendencies of being a psychopath. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of like the distinction between what Robert Hare and his research have shown and the cases of like Hannibal Lecter and Patrick Bateman and the like shown in movies that are attempting to portray what psychopaths would be like. So in real life, there are plenty of psychopaths out there. There are millions of them around the world, but they almost never become serial killers. There are very few serial killers, period. Ted Bundy is an example of somebody who was both psychopath and a serial killer, but almost all psychopaths do not become serial killers. And again, it's not so much that they necessarily, find it morally objectionable. It's just that it doesn't seem to be in their own interest. So like, why would they bother? What's in it for them to go around and kill a bunch of people? How am I going to benefit from that? If there was a way that they could benefit from that, if they meet somebody in an alley and there's nobody else around and they know the person has $20 in their pocket, maybe they stab the person to death, take the $20, and then by lunchtime they were forgotten about this. It's not bothering them at all. But just leaving a trail of corpses behind you is a good way to get caught and go to jail. And they don't want to go to jail. So generally that is enough to keep them from becoming serial killers. And in fact, in most cases they're not violent criminals at all. What they are much more often than violent criminals is con men. And so people that are operating these call centers that are trying to bilk people out of their life savings by saying, hey, we're calling from your bank and can you give us your password so that we can reset this account? We're concerned that somebody was trying to hack into your account. And so, posing as somebody who's looking to help them, they're able to gain the person's confidence and then gain their money in the long run. So they just find positions basically that allow them to exploit other people's trust. And so Robert Hare says it's not so much serial killers that are sort of the classic example of where psychopaths end up, but they may be politicians and they may be, CEOs, businessmen, and sort of respected members of the community until we find out many years later what they were up to. In the case of George Santos, it didn't take many years because he was saying too many lies in front of too many people. So he's no longer in Congress, but Bernie Madoff got away with it for many years, just running his scheme. But meets the criteria of sort of classic psychopath if you look at the Robert Hare checklist. So this other guy here is not as recognizable a face probably. That's Frank Abagnale. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because there is a movie about him, and that is Catch Me If You Can with Tom Hanks and Leonardo DiCaprio. And Frank Abagnale is the real person who was portrayed on film by Leonardo DiCaprio. And he was just, very successful con man and pathological liar and able to talk his way into all sorts of things that were beneficial to him and detrimental to the people around him. The punchline of his story, though, is it turns out they learned, many years after the film had been made, that he had fabricated a lot of the details of the story as well. So even like in being a con man, who's conning people about how good a con man he was, but I think that's sort of fitting and an amusing coda to the movie. So other thing I wanted to mention about psychopaths is the evolutionary perspective. So looking at it as an evolutionary psychologist or as an evolutionary biologist, if it turns out that there are certain genes that predispose somebody towards becoming a psychopath, there's a question of like, how do those genes stay in the population? So this is what Linda Mealy wrote about. This is back in the 1990s. She was speculating on this. And what we see is it is about 1% to 2% of people. And this is pretty standard, across countries, across cultures. It is more common in males than in females, but overall, it's at least 1% of people are these psychopaths that just don't experience remorse, don't experience guilt at all. And so generally what you see over evolutionary time due to natural selection is if something is working, then it's just going to spread through the population. If it works to walk on two legs, then that will spread through the population. Now all humans are, have adaptations for bipedal locomotion. We have opposable thumbs, we have the vertebrate eye. All of these adaptations spread through the population. They're now species typical. But the tendency to be a psychopath is not. And on the other hand, if you get to some like weird mutation and it's not beneficial, then that just generally gets screened out, selected out within a couple of generations. And we don't see either one happening with psychopathy. What happens is that it stays about the same from generation to generation. And so she explained it, the fact that it's not going away, but it's also not spreading, so that it becomes sort of the standard trait in the population, is through what's called frequency-dependent selection. So the idea of that is, in contrast to most of these traits that either spread through the population if they're beneficial, or they just get selected out if they're not, how successful being a psychopath makes somebody depends on how many other psychopaths there are in the population. And if you live in a population where, basically everybody is trustworthy, and somebody comes up to you and tells you a sob story about, like, I don't have any money, I need to get a ride to get to the hospital, my kid is there and just suffered this serious injury, can you give me money just for, a cab ride or Uber and get over there? I would, be forever grateful. Then you're a lot more likely to believe them in that circumstance. If, you've encountered 1,000 people in your life and none of them have ever lied to you, then you have no reason to doubt this particular person here. You just feel sorry for them. If, on the other hand, you're in a culture where, like, every other person you meet is a pathological liar and you cannot take at face value anything they say to you without presenting some, like, firm evidence of it, then you're going to be very skeptical of it, right? So in a population where there are a bunch of psychopaths tend not to be as successful as everybody else. So that would make the numbers come back down. In a population where they're extremely rare, they are more successful than everybody else overall, just measured in terms of, like, how successful they are at, like, surviving and getting their genes into the next generation. And so what happens is it just arrives at this sort of, like, stable level, which is, as it turns out, somewhere between 1% and 2%. That's about how many psychopaths a population can maintain before people become so skeptical of them that being a psychopath no longer allows you to be successful at, getting your genes through. So speaking of getting your genes through, I want to talk about area that's more directly related to my own field of study. That's attraction and mate selection. And so talk about some of the components of mate value and assortative mating. So components of mate value differ for context. So depending on whether you're asking about short-term mating, which is hooking up and one-night stands and those sorts of things, or long-term mating, where somebody is considering a person to be potential boyfriend, girlfriend, or a spouse. And so you do see some shifts there. Now, in terms of, like, physical attractiveness, it's the same general traits that people will find physically attractive across different contexts, but how important physical attractiveness is compared to intelligence and kindness and sense of humor and so forth fluctuates a bit, where for the short term, it's just that becomes relatively more important than it is. While still important for most people in choosing a long-term mate, there are, a dozen or 24 other things that are also quite important. And so it doesn't hold sort of like the primary spot necessarily when we're talking about long-term mating. Assortative mating is this entire field of research and, like, 100 or more studies that have been done over the years looking at all sorts of different traits. And this is in contrast to sort of the conventional wisdom, also depicted, frequently on stage and screen, that opposites attract. What we find much more often, and on average, is that people tend to resemble their partners more than they would if they were just pairing up with people at random. So the exact opposite of the adage that opposites attract. In fact, people have much more in common with their partners. Now, there's a few reasons for that. One is just, like, where do people meet their partners in the first place? My wife is a psychologist, and that's not a coincidence. We would not have met in the first place if we hadn't both been studying psychology at the same university at the same time. So that's a part of it. But there is also good evidence of a preference for somebody that has a lot in common with you. Certainly with respect to, like, ideological positions and so forth, it's a lot more comfortable for people to have a conversation with somebody where your reaction to the things they're saying is, I know, right? As opposed to, yeah, I don't think that's true. I don't think this is going to work. But also just in terms of physical appearance, what we find is just much higher resemblance between people and their partners than would be expected if they were just randomly pairing up let alone if they were specifically trying to get somebody who was really different from them. So that's assortative mating, or what's called positive assortment, the fact that people are positively correlated with their partners. But if that's what's driving it, the more similar a partner is, the more likely you are to find them attractive and to end up in a relationship, and the more likely that relationship is to be sustained. Then what you would predict just on the basis of that is that people would be really attracted to like their immediate family members. And that is the opposite of what we find. People are disgusted by the thought of being attracted to their immediate family members, let alone being like sexually active with them. And this comes from something called the Westermark effect. So this is, there's basically a critical period of development in childhood during which if you're raised in the same place with this other person, then when you grow up, you will not find them attractive, right? And that's true whether they are genetically related to you or not. So it's true just as much if like it's somebody who is adopted into the family. You are not going to be attracted to that person if you were raised with them. But if if a sibling was put up for adoption, you never met them until you're an adult, there's no particular reason you wouldn't be attracted to them. So it boils down to like, we can't detect the genes. And certainly, over evolutionary history, we couldn't detect, do they actually have the same genes that I do? So, so similar that it would be bad if we mated together. But what you can tell is you have these like cues to, okay, they're probably closely related to me. We're in the same house. I saw my mother breastfeeding them when they were 1 year old and so forth. And so those are the cues that lead to this sort of like the activation of this incest avoidance mechanism that we have. And that is what's referred to as the Westermark effect. So there's an exception to that in Game of Thrones, but in real life, this tends not to happen. In the cases where it does happen, where you have siblings who are attracted to each other, it's these they were separated very early in childhood, or they never met each other, they met as adults, and at that point it was too late for the Westermark effect. So like if somebody points out to them at some point, oh, actually, it turns out that person is your sister, then they will just sort of have to consciously say like, oh, well then that's not cool. I shouldn't be in a relationship with them, or not that kind of relationship at least. But the visceral attraction would have still been there in the first place if there wasn't that input during early childhood to persuade them that like this is a person that it would not be in your interest to be attracted to when you grow up. Okay, so I want to talk about. So we've got just a few minutes left here. I want to try to wrap up around 1 o'clock. So let me just kind of speed through some of this here, and we'll wrap up after this topic on attraction and mate selection. So I want to contrast what the evidence from the research shows with not just what's depicted in movies and TV shows, but what is sort of received as common knowledge, basically. And that is basically sort of like a blank slate model of where attractiveness perception comes from. That people think, well, you don't actually have the preferences for a while. They're just sort of like imposed upon you by your culture, and you see, beautiful people on billboards and beauty magazines and in TV shows and movies. And you learn from that, oh, these are the people that are attractive. Okay. And then over time, you become attracted to that, so that by the time you're an adult, you end up attracted to the people that the media have been telling you. These are what attractive people look like. And so that's what's referred to as, the idea of being conventionally attractive, as opposed to like there's some sort of like instinctive drive to be attracted to people with certain features more than others. There is this sort of assumption that these things are largely culturally determined and that the features are more or less arbitrary. But if you look at actually how similar the preferences are across cultures and compare that to like how much variation you would see if it really were truly arbitrary, that story doesn't really bear much water, because what you would find if they were truly arbitrary is much wider variation than what we see. People can point to, oh, look, this is what was considered attractive in the 1920s, and look how different it is from what's considered attractive today, or this is what's attractive in our culture, but look at this hunter-gatherer tribe, and they find this other feature attractive where they do this particular form of like piercing or ornamentation or something. But these are just sort of like at the periphery of what is overall attractive. And I would say like if it were truly arbitrary, then you could just put anybody on the cover of beauty magazines, expose somebody to that, and then they would end up developing attraction to that. So it could be somebody who has lost most of their hair and lost most of their teeth, and they have severe skin lesions and parasitic infestations and so forth, and just tell people like, no, look at the beauty magazine, this is what's attractive. And they would grow up, if you saw that enough, then that's what you would find arousing. once you entered puberty, became an adult. But I would say that there's no evidence that that is actually the case. That we're really pretty constrained to be attracted, the same as any other sexually reproducing species is, to be attracted to the things that that served our ancestors well in terms of like directing them towards people who are more likely to be healthy and fertile and bear healthy and fertile offspring. You know, even though we might perceive, because we're focusing on what the differences are, that there is pretty dramatic difference across time and across cultures, that variation is quite small compared to how large it could be if it were just genuinely, we could be attracted to literally anything. So there are just a couple of studies that I want to mention now. One of them is sort of a classic study by Judy Langlois, and this was at University of Texas all the way back in the 1980s. And she was thinking, well, you know, if we want to test and see whether these preferences develop over time in response to exposure to media telling them this is what's attractive, this is what's not, then we could, you know, select a population, study them, and see, like, is that the case if they haven't been exposed to those types of images. And so her participants were infants, ranging from about 2 months to about 8 months of age. And what they would do is they put a screen in front of them and they show images of just different people's faces. And these people's faces have previously been rated by adults for like how attractive they are on that 1 to 10 scale. And it turns out the babies just like to stare a lot longer at the faces that the adults rated as more attractive. So the, you know, the most parsimonious explanation there is just like, well, the babies also think they're more attractive, and they haven't ever read a beauty magazine or seen a movie or anything. But they already, by the time they're 2 to 3 months old, have the same preferences. And if you're just looking at like, basically, you know, translating time staring at a screen into like rating given to a photo, you put them in the same metric, you can't tell which ratings are coming from the babies and which ratings are coming from the adults. They have the same taste in judging attractiveness. But, you know, there's slight variation, but there's general agreement. There's high inter-rater reliability, what we say. So that's Judy Langlois' study. One of the specific features that has been studied as a predictor of attractiveness ratings is what's called the waist-to-hip ratio. And this is particularly in men's ratings of women's attractiveness. If they have more of like an hourglass figure, that's a low waist-to-hip ratio that tends to lead to higher ratings of attractiveness. And so this is Johan Permans here. He and his colleagues decided to do a study to, you know, distinguish between like, is this something that's just sort of like imposed upon people because they've seen these images over and over again, they've been photoshopped to, you know, make the waist more slender in these models photo shoots and so forth, or is it something else that doesn't depend on their having been exposed to this stuff? So the question is there is, what population would you study in that case? What's a population of men who have never seen images of women that could have potentially shaped their preference for waist-to-hip ratio? And so you might think about hunter-gatherer tribe, or you might think of somebody who grows up in a culture where women are covered for religious reasons, or you might have, you know, a variety of ways of sort of like getting, maybe the Amish, getting a population that hasn't been exposed to quite as many images, but still they would have seen some of these things. And so what he thought to do was like, what if all of our participants are blind men? So we know they haven't, because men who've been blind since birth. We know they've never seen a picture of a woman, they've never seen anything. So how do you study their preference for waist-to-hip ratio? So rather than rating photos, which is what they do in most of these types of studies, you have them rate the attractiveness of these different mannequins, basically, and go around the room and just feel them and say, yes, this one I find very sexy, this one's attractive, this one I don't like quite as much. And so they rated them based on sense of touch. And what he found was the preferences for waist-to-hip ratio in the blind men are the same as the preferences were in previous studies, where I remember just rating the photographs. And so let's see, I think I don't have time to get into the personality, and we're past 1 o'clock at this point. So I just want to wrap up right now, I guess, having now covered my sort of favorite stuff to talk about, which is the evolutionary psychology and attractiveness perception. And, you know, if there's any sort of like quick take-home message from this, I suppose it's that if you compare depictions in TV shows and movies from 1950s and 60s to today, things have generally gotten a little more accurate. The viewers have gotten a little bit more sophisticated. The general public is generally more knowledgeable about psychological disorders than they were a few generations back. But still, you know, what you generally see is they sort of exaggerate things just for comedic effect, or they exaggerate things because it makes for a compelling storyline, or because it, you know, tricks the viewer a little bit more effectively if you can make something seem a bit more dramatic. And so no surprise there that they take artistic license and how these things are depicted, but I wanted to just teach you a little bit about what, from my perspective as a psychology professor, we actually know about the different disorders and about attraction misperception and so forth as well. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. That's it from me today. Thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your days. Take care.